Good evening, everyone. First, I want to begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay my respect to their elders, past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples here today. My name is Christoph Nidupilwang. I'm the director of the Griffith Asia Institute, and it's a wonderful great pleasure to see so many people here. We were almost a little bit afraid that the rain is going to deter some of you, but much to the difference, we are having a wonderful, wonderful crowd. So very warm welcome to all of you. And it's my great pleasure today to also introduce, of course, our speaker who came up this morning from Canberra, Nicole Curato. She's a professor of political sociology at the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at the University of Canberra. Her research focuses on the dynamics of democratic innovations and in the aftermath of tragedies, for example, disasters, armed conflicts, and urban crime. She has authored a number of books, most recently also Democracy in a Time of Misery, From Spectacular Tragedy to Deliberative Action. And she has a number of academic positions. She serves as the editor of the Journal of Deliberative Democracy. She has received several grants, for example, from the Australian Research Council, including the Discovery Early Career Research Award, a discovery project on a meta-study of democratic deliberation, a linkage project on the Global Citizens Assembly on genome editing, very interesting, and a special research initiative on deliberative integrity. She also collaborates internationally, for example, with the Norwegian Research Council grant focused on the strongmen of Asia. Now, she's not only an academic, she also engages very much in public engagement, contributing to op-eds and newspaper articles, really globally in New York Times, The Guardian, Al Jazeera, and of course also for our Australian community, like the Australian Journal of Foreign Affairs. She collaborates with CNN in the Philippines in conceptualizing television specials and occasionally serves as a television presenter. Nicole has also hosted documentaries and produced podcasts for various media outlets. So it is my absolute great pleasure to welcome her here. Before, though, I also want to thank our student helpers who have been wonderful, and of course, most importantly, also our gracious host where we are here today, the Queensland Gallery of Modern Arts. With that, Nicole, very warm welcome to you.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you to the Griffith Asia Institute, the Australian Centre of Asia-Pacific Arts, and the Gallery of Modern Art for inviting me to share my ideas with you this evening. My notes actually was supposed to start with a joke about Canberra weather and Brisbane weather, but I'm now scrapping that because of the heavy rains at the moment. So let's get right through it. My presentation tonight presents a hopeful story from the Philippines. By hopeful story, I don't mean a naive story. I don't mean stories fueled by toxic positivity. The hopeful stories I would like to share this evening are stories that connect critique, what is wrong and what must be changed, and political agency, what we can do together to advance a transformative agenda. Henry Giroux refers to this as subversive hope. To hope is a defiant practice that connects critique and transformation. Subversive hope challenges profound pessimism by advancing plausible political projects that allow us to survive, if not flourish, in today's highly unequal, climate-challenged, and truth-compromised world. So let's start with a critique. I wonder how many of you in this room has heard this story. The golden age of the Philippines is about to come, according to YouTube. It's a channel produced by Kaalam, a channel that produces explainers on current events. The story goes this way. President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., one explainer said, is making progress in unlocking quadrillions of dollars of gold reserves. 2,832,250 million to be exact, after his meetings with World Bank officials in Washington, D.C. The process takes time, viewers were told, as legal procedures need to be followed. But there's no need to fret. Prosperity is in our country's destiny, according to another explainer. The Philippines is sitting on a mountain of gold, as it was written in the Book of Solomon. God anointed the late President Ferdinand Marcos Sr. to realize this destiny, who, according to his presidency, invested 950,000 metric tons of gold that General Tomoyuki Yamashita and the Japanese soldiers buried during the Second World War. And now, it is his son and namesake who will realize this destiny and use the country's gold reserves to invest in education, health, and infrastructure. Beautiful story. Over the past year, our research team has been monitoring reports of misleading claims, historical distortions, and clickbait headlines that shape public discourse on politics and governance in the Philippines. And the Marcos gold myth figures prominently in these reports. Kaalam, which in Filipino means fellow knower, is one of the many YouTube channels that publish content on the Marcos gold myth. These channels are wildly popular. Kaalam, for example, has nearly 1 million subscribers. There are various ways of interpreting the popularity of these narratives. One approach is to portray Filipinos as naive citizens, desperate for quick solutions to deep-rooted problems. In this interpretation, Filipinos are portrayed as people who lost their free will because of disinformation. In 2018, Katie Harbath, Facebook's public policy director for global elections, named the Philippines as the patient zero in the global disinformation epidemic. For her, Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte, his electoral victory was, and I quote, the beginning. A month later, it was Brexit, and then Trump got the nomination, and then you had the US elections. Similarly, Cambridge Analytica whistleblower Christopher Wiley described the Philippines as a petri dish. The country has high usage of Facebook with very little regulation, which allows bad actors to test out media manipulation strategies before implementing them in Western liberal democracies. And as Wiley puts it, you can experiment on tactics and techniques that you wouldn't be able to easily test in the West, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't matter, you won't get caught. And if it does work, then you can figure out how to port that in other countries. And this story plays out really well. Many pundits describe the Philippines as one of the first countries to ride the global wave of populism. Before Brexit and Trump, the Philippines, one of Asia's oldest democracies, elected Rodrigo Duterte, a man whose main campaign promise was to kill all drug addicts. And this is a president who actually delivered on his promise, such that today the International Criminal Court is investigating whether the police killings of suspected drug addicts have reached genocidal proportions. But the story does not end there. In May last year, the Philippines headed to the polls and elected Sara Duterte, Rodrigo Duterte's daughter, as vice president. Her running mate was Ferdinand Marcos Jr., the son and namesake of the late dictator who was ousted from power in a peaceful revolution in 1986. The Marcos dictatorship was the Philippines' darkest period. 50,000 people had been detained, including human rights activists, journalists, church workers, students, activists, and the political opposition. There were 1,900 desaparecidos, or people who disappeared during the Marcos regime. Their photos are right in front of you. The Marcoses are among the most notorious for plundering the nation's wealth. such as banks in Switzerland were pressured to return the wealth the Marcoses stole from the Philippine government after the Marcoses were ousted from power in 1986. And it's not just Ferdinand Marcos Jr. who won the election last May. His son, Ferdinand Alexander III, won a seat in Congress as well. Marcos Jr.'s sister, Amy, is a sitting senator, the picture that you see in the middle. His cousin, Martin Romualdez, is the Speaker of the House, the picture you see on the right. And yes, Imelda Marcos is still alive. So how did they mount their spectacular political comeback? Many studies point to the systematic disinformation on social media. In the past few years, for example, many conspiracy theories emerged on YouTube that put into question the real reason why the people power revolution that ousted the Marcos dictatorship happened. Apparently, the CIA had something to do with it. The Marcos regime, according to this story, was the golden age of the Philippines. Bridges were built. Singapore looked to the Philippines for inspiration. Apparently, Lee Kuan Yew was inspired by Marcos Sr. The country apparently was the envy of the world. And apparently, the Marcoses had stashes of gold that they will redistribute to the nation now that Marcos Jr. is president. This was the story I mentioned at the start of my presentation. Meanwhile, investigative journalists have uncovered a network of TikTok influencers that created a celebrity out of the late dictator's grandchildren, portraying them as heartthrobs and celebrities in their own right. Not sure about the heartthrob, but that's TikTok for you. It seems benign, but these are used to soften the Marcos name that was once associated to brutality. As Columbia University journalism professor Sheila Coronel puts it, today, we don't need military censors in newsrooms or tanks rolling down the street. While the first Marcos produced heroic epics about himself and his wife, his son prefers vlogs, dance challenges, and other viral content that serve as a distraction from the real Marcos story. Marcos Jr. is strongman light, cotton candy confected for TikTok. So this is the dominant narrative that explains why there are deep political divisions in the Philippines today. Bad actors like Cambridge Analytica, the illiberal regime of Rodrigo Duterte, the power and money of the Marcoses, the irresponsibility of Facebook or Meta, influencers who sell their services to unscrupulous actors, and some other forms of technological alchemy, all combined, manipulated our digital public sphere. This is the dominant narrative that we hear from journalists, activists, donors, and some tech platforms and aid agencies. Consequently, some journalists and digital rights activists exerted pressure on tech platforms to take accountability for the damage they have done to democracies around the world, while civil society groups double down on voter education, fact-checking, and digital literacy campaigns. I fully respect these initiatives, but I'm not persuaded. I think these are very dangerous narratives that we peddle to the world. There are clear democratic harms when we believe these narratives. Why is that? First, I think it is our responsibility as academics to question unreliable narrators when it comes to telling stories about disinformation. There is a market incentive for commercial actors to overstate the impact of Cambridge Analytica because it allows them to sell the same services. Second, I think it is unhelpful to use a Western liberal lens to interpret practices of disinformation in the Global South. The narrative I mentioned is too homogenizing, if not colonial, in its thinking. It portrays the Global South as a recipient of disinformation tactics devised in the West. We are described as a petri dish, the patient zero, as if societies in the Global South have no agency. Third, these narratives displace the voices of ordinary citizens. Citizens in these narratives are portrayed as unknowing victims of manipulation rather than political actors who have their own views about the information landscape. Why do I find these narratives unhelpful? Because they foreclose dialogue and deliberation. Once we consider citizens we disagree with as delusional, unthinking, manipulable, and naive, we stop seeing them as conversation partners. We see them as politically illiterate citizens who should be made to read fact-check reports and sit through voter education programs. What we lose when we think this way is our capacity to listen to other people's legitimate grievances, which leads them to distrust established sources of information. Once we see our fellow citizens as people who lost their free will, we turn to techno-chauvinist solutions and assume that technological solutions are the best solutions and superior to people-based solutions because there's no way people can talk to each other and bridge parallel public spheres together. Only tech can do that. And once we see our fellow citizens as enemies who voted for corrupt or genocidal politicians, we forget that someone benefits from a divided public sphere. We forget that people in power further entrench their power when they pit fellow citizens against each other. We lose our capacity for radical empathy. So going back to the Philippines, it breaks my heart to hear people say that jeepney drivers on strike deserve that their livelihoods are at risk. After all, they voted for Marcos Jr., the president who supported the phasing out of jeepneys in the Philippines. I've read tweets that said, "Let them suffer." I've also heard people refuse to give donations to typhoon victims. For them, typhoon victims who voted for Marcos Jr. should only rely on Marcos Jr. and his social welfare ministry. They think typhoon victims do not deserve the goodwill of citizens who voted for the opposition candidate who had a better track record of disaster response. This is what we lose when we buy into the dominant narrative of disinformation. We lose our capacity to extend solidarity. We see respect as conditional because all other citizens are unthinking anyway. So what can we do? And this is the hope part. The first part was critique. This is the part about hope. I have two suggestions. First, a pathway forward is to take a longer view of disinformation or false narratives. Second, we need to move beyond technologically deterministic solutions or interventions that pathologize naive citizens falling for fool's gold. Let's discuss the first point. In my decade-long field research in disaster-affected communities in the Philippines that describe themselves as Marcos loyalists, I found that the gold myths I described earlier had been deeply embedded in the nation's social imaginary long before disinformation took off on social media. My research participants in their 40s, for example, told me that they grew up hearing stories of treasure hunters going on perilous expeditions to find Yamashita's gold. One recalled a neighbor who suddenly and suspiciously had money to buy a brand new motorcycle and open a hair salon downtown. No one dared to ask the neighbor where the money came from. It was, after all, impolite to do so. But there was a rumor. There was a rumor that the neighbor's distant relative lucked out in finding the Yamashita treasure. The motorcycle and the hair salon were the cut they took from their relative's treasure trove. "Did you get a cut too?" I asked my research participant in jest. "No," he responded. "I'll wait for the 1 million. He said, chuckling. By 1 million, he was referring to the cut he would get from the Marcoses once the gold reserves were cashed in. Filipinos see unexplained wealth every day. The neighbor across the road who got a new motorcycle, the newly elected mayor who started sporting a Rolex, the customs official who suddenly had funds for home renovation. A society with credible institutions would allow everyday citizens to interrogate unexplained wealth. Seeing corrupt public officials behind bars provides closure to the story of accountability. But this is not the Philippine society. We turn to myths, urban legends, and rumors to make sense of suspicious situations because we cannot count on our institutions to make sense of this and give closure to the story. I have met people who fervently believe in the gold myth, including those who fell for scams that promised gold bars. However, I also noticed that many are laughing it off, knowing that the claim is frivolous, but they go along with it anyway because it makes a good conversation topic. It opens a hopeful discussion of what one could do with ₱1,000,000. In my field site, a woman said that the first thing she'd do with ₱1,000,000 is to pay their debts, as the electricity company just sent a final notice of disconnection. Another said she'd spend it on her mother's hospital bills and maintenance medications. A young mother asked me if $1,000,000 is enough to send 4 children to high school. A man in his early 20s estimated that $1,000,000 is just enough to cover his and his brother's expenses to relocate to Saudi Arabia as construction workers once the deployment ban is lifted. These informal chats with my research participants made one thing clear to me. The power of the Marcos gold myth lies in the conversations it provokes. It sets off discussions about fantasies as well as realistic aspirations of where people want their lives to be headed. Beyond fooling Filipinos, the danger of the Marcos gold myth is the constraint it places on people's imagination to pursue plausible political projects on which to pin their hopes. How do we overcome this? To overcome this, we need to move beyond technologically deterministic solutions or interventions that pathologize naive citizens. In our research, we advanced a community engagement action plan that calls for collaborations among content creators, primary school teachers, librarians, and community leaders to create opportunities for ordinary Filipinos to be courageous and creative in advancing conversations that interrogate dubious claims while building people's esteem and their capacities to aspire. We call for creative, collaborative, and long-term oriented solutions that address not just the problem of disinformation, but deep division. As my collaborator Jonathan Corpus Ong puts it, we need to shake things up and blast open the space for new collaborations to come in with their diverse perspectives and skill sets. And so in the remaining part of my talk, I want to provide some examples of community-based collaborations. Let's talk about 3 examples. First, we see the need for creative storytelling about disinformation beyond the stupid voter narrative. I'm not sure what it's like in other countries, but in the Philippines, as I hinted at a while ago, there is a tendency to blame uneducated people, those who have cheap smartphones, as victims of disinformation. You know, they have cheap smartphones, Facebook is free, they're uneducated. They're the stupid masa or mass voter. And so the interventions that we've seen so far are largely focused on educating uneducated voters. While this is well-intentioned, I think this often plays into the populist playbook that pits the people against the condescending liberal elites. We need to change the narrative. What can we do? A couple of years ago, my colleagues and I experimented on conducting a nationwide deliberative forum on disinformation. We selected 26 randomly selected everyday Filipinos from all over the country to come together to learn about disinformation. They represented a variety of ages, gender, region, socioeconomic status. They listened to some experts on disinformation. They deliberated on the dangers created by the spread of fake news, answering questions of who should be accountable for the production of disinformation and who should safeguard social media from its harms. So the picture that you see there is one of our youngest participants in this forum. It all happened online via Zoom because this was during the pandemic. There are several insights that emerged from this exercise, but I will only focus on 2. First, participants situated disinformation as part of the wider problem of money politics. As one participant puts it, fake news is just like vote buying. While vote buying pays for votes, fake news pays for voice. It was a familiar practice for many of our participants, one that predates social media. The people in our forum did not buy into the moral panics about disinformation, because they take a longer view of disinformation. For them, the problem is actually not disinformation, but political inequality. You see, in the Philippines, 70% of Congress is run by people who inherited their position from a family member. It's fairly common for a district representative to complete a 3-year term and then run for the position of mayor. And then the seat of district representative that person leaves will be more or less uncontested because the person running for the seat is the district representative's son, daughter, wife, father, mother, or even mistress. So, for ordinary citizens, the solution for tech regulation or legislation is actually fairly marginal. The issue for them is the concentration of political and economic power to the hands of a few families. People who control money control information. And so when we asked them for their recommendations about addressing fake news, they were a bit blasé about it. They were like, but that's not the problem, isn't it? And we have the solution. All we have to do is to implement the anti-political dynasty law. No matter what you do with fake news, the problem is political inequality. That does not sound naive to me. That to me sounds like ordinary citizens taking a long view of disinformation and diagnosing a deeper political problem beyond fake news. Second, participants recognized that disinformation thrives and cannot be disentangled from economic insecurity. Those trafficking in disinformation can include both journalists struggling to make ends meet and everyday citizens seeking creative ways to make money. In the Philippines, there is a generation of subcontracted, tech-savvy millennials who have developed a skill of code switching, turning on an American accent when answering phones for an American call center, and putting on an Australian twang to provide tech support to Australian clients who are desperate for better internet connection. How else can we monetize this skill set? How else can we monetize the skill set of precarious digital workers? By working as fake account operators. These workers are skilled to assume different identities, just like they assume different identities in their call center jobs. They are used to vernaculars of pop culture and expressions that establish emotional resonances with the audience. There is a commercial incentive to be rude and controversial because the more retweets or the more reposts, the higher the pay. So for our participants, the issue is not necessarily disinformation. The issue is precarity of labor. And I think, again, that is such a profound diagnosis of the problem of disinformation in the Philippines. To our participants, everyday people who are dismissed as naive, their diagnosis is much deeper. It's not about tech platforms, it's about labor justice. So what is the takeaway from this example? For me, the takeaway is we can tell an alternative story about disinformation. This story of deliberation tells the story of people coming from different biographical and political perspectives, coming together, thinking together, diagnosing the problem together. Contrary to the dominant narrative of disinformation, the enemy is not the stupid other. The enemy or the people that should be held accountable are the people in power. Let me cite 2 more examples of community collaborations that we are advocating. Our second call is to co-create open access disinformation and digital ethics educational resources. As academics, we recognize that many of us are terrible at curating our research findings, and we need to collaborate with people outside the academy, but we need to be more creative. And so we are calling for collaborations with primary and secondary school teachers, as well as people from development, communication, and yes, content creators on TikTok and Instagram to co-design conversation guidelines that can be directly used in our everyday lives. When I do my speaking tours in the Philippines, I often get asked when I talk to high school students and university students, when I talk to them about this information, the questions I always get asked are practical questions about how to navigate life in parallel public spheres. How can I talk to my auntie who believes in conspiracy theories? How can I repair my relationship with my parents who disowned me because I campaigned for the political opposition? How can I call out a history teacher who teaches distorted truths about the Marcos dictatorship? As an academic, I have answers from normative political theory or political behavior, but I have no clue on how to translate this to everyday vernaculars, to content that is emotionally appealing, while also intellectually satisfying. I think if we get our act together, I think this collaboration is powerful in empowering us to develop our skills in active listening, in radical empathy, and vigorous argumentation without condescension. Finally, we are supporting whistleblowers to expose the so-called disinformation for hire industry. What do we mean by this? My co-investigator, Jonathan Corpus Ong, has a podcast series on Spotify, this is not a paid ad, called Catch Me If You Can. In this podcast, he and his co-host, Kat Ventura, feature disgruntled creative workers who tell the most fascinating stories of how creative workers in the Philippines ended up working for political campaigns as part of a wider disinformation operation. So in a way, one can call these programs the confessions of trolls for hire. It's an initiative I'm closely following because I think this opens up room for deliberation about the ethics of influencer marketing and what led people to take part in disinformation operations. And what's fascinating about this podcast is its focus on corporate creatives, people who are educated, relatively well-paid, and highly skilled. It spotlights the complicity of the advertising industry and the seemingly open secret that everyone from Manila's elite knows about. It shifts the discussion of accountability from the so-called stupid voters to people who make huge profits from disinformation. So in conclusion, can deliberation bridge divided publics? The answer is yes, but we need to be creative. As the first example demonstrates, we need to craft spaces for public deliberation, to curate spaces where diverse people have enough time to discuss different perspectives and scrutinize each other's arguments. And our deliberative forum is an example of this. Second, we can build on each other's skills, expertise, and experience. Our responses to populism will not work if we are only deliberating among like-minded people or people with the same biographical or professional experience. Hence our proposal for co-creating disinformation and digital ethics resources contextualized in our divided societies. And I believe Australia is also having a moment of reckoning about the need for this. And finally, we need to place power at the heart of our discussion. The podcast that I talked about a while ago may seem mundane, but it is these mundane practices that can reorient the content of our public conversations about to whom we place the accountability and blame for our divided public spheres. Is it the stupid voter, or is it the chief architects of disinformation? Taken together, I hope my presentation advanced a plausible, invigorating, and subversively hopeful account of how we can bridge our divided publics. Thank you for your attention.
All right, Nicole, thank you so much. That was really invigorating and thought-provoking, and also wonderful timing for us to have sufficient space for questions from the audience. And anyone has a question that wants to start right away before I start my stupid questions?
Hi, I'm David Shack, adjunct professor at Griffith Asia Institute. A couple of things. One is you didn't mention, at least what I see is, the importance of institutions. Being able to explain institutions to students at, let's say, the junior high, high school, middle school level, so that they understand what institutions are and their importance. And the other thing is just getting people to understand in practical terms why politics is important to you. I mean, you're going to worry about being able to join a union, or being able to get a raise in pay, or what's going to happen to interest rates and things like this. And that's politics. And yet people, I've been teaching for years and years here at Griffith. Most of my students, even business students, don't seem to have any understanding or consciousness of this at all.
Maybe let's collect 2 or 3 questions if we have more. Yes, please.
Hi, when we're actually educating people to be critical thinkers, to look at evidence-based, you would think it would be like a house of cards, that they would actually start questioning, and that starts a strong dialogue. But in globalness, isn't it the critical thinkers and the evidence-based information that destroys disinformation, and a sheep like a tendency to follow?
That was a very good question. I have a question too. If there's so much disinformation, and I remember I was in the US when Trump got elected, and you also had a Shorenstein Center as one of your collaborators. I was at the Kennedy School. And when Trump was elected, there was this absolute breakdown at the school. Literally, we couldn't have, on the day after Trump got elected, there was no class. It was just hand-holding and crying and kind of disbelief. And people were like, so what's truth? Is there truth still? And it was very interesting listening to you, I found, because it's like, all right, we've been before our votes were bought, and now we get all this disinformation. What does it matter? And if everybody knows that there's only disinformation, does it still matter?
That is so dramatic, Christoph. But yes, does it all matter? No, that's actually a very important question, because, of course, everyone who supports democracy think that, of course, truth is the foundation of democracy. How can we make collective decisions together if we don't share the same sets of facts, if we don't share the same sets of truths? And I think this also actually connects to the question about critical thinkers, right? The importance of critical thinkers in destroying disinformation. One of the projects I'm actually working on today as part of the Strongmen of Asia project with a former journalist, Sofia Toma Cruz, is studying conspiracy theories in the Philippines. And we are trying to understand the architecture of conspiracy theories. And actually, interestingly, the architectures of conspiracy theories mirror the architecture of critical thinking. Influencers who peddle conspiracy theories invite people to a conversation. They say, but don't believe me, do your own research, fact check your research. Oh, but don't just listen to me, read what is the counterpart of the New York Times, and read The Guardian, and compare what you find, right? It's very fascinating, because the architectures of conspiracy theorists and those who peddle it and those who believe them are actually people who read across different platforms, are people who actually try to understand the perspective of the other and try to engage as many perspectives as possible before they come up with a solution. And I think this points at a bigger, deeper problem, that it's not just critical thinking that is within the domain of people who believe in the virtues of liberal democracy. Believers of conspiracy theories actually think they are the critical thinkers, right? So that is the bigger danger, especially for people like us who do work on deliberative democracy. How can we deliberate with people who have massively departed from the same premises that democracy requires? And I think this speaks to your point that we're just so immobilized, right? Like, what is the way forward? But this is why I think curating spaces like the deliberative forum that I talked a while ago, whether it's online, whether it's offline, whether it's in your town halls, whether it's in your church, or any form of public space that brings together a diversity of people is important. We need to craft these spaces. We need to be intentional in crafting these spaces. Because what we discover when we bring people from different epistemologies together is some form of common ground. We realize that actually there are concerns that we share, right? One of my favorite examples in the studies of deliberative democracy are bringing together conflicting parties in Northern Ireland, right? Divided by division. But if you bring them together and they don't talk about religion and they talk about very practical problems like schools, policing, when we talk about these practical problems, then we can move forward together. We realize that there is something in common that we share, that there are shared problems that reduce the qualities of our lives, and so we can move forward from there. So maybe that is one path forward, creating these spaces where we can solve collective problems, practical problems together, without necessarily engaging with those deeply rooted divisions. And in a way, it creates a more pluralistic atmosphere for our democracy, right? We just have an acceptance that maybe we cannot convince this person at this very moment that, that Trump did lose the elections. But maybe if we talk about the deteriorating quality of schools, maybe we can move forward together. Maybe we can appreciate each other's humanity. The point about young people today not understanding why politics is important, I think I have to push back against this idea, because I think the way politics is expressed today is so different from the way we experienced politics previously, about joining labor unions, joining social movements. I know there is this allergy by some people about the digital, but these are the facts now. Young people use digital first when it comes to political engagement. Is it less valid? I don't think so. A lot of the contestations, to me, the way I define politics is contestation, right? It's contesting an idea, it's contesting a dominant idea, it's contesting power, trying to forge struggles and new forms of doing things. These are happening on social media, whether that's the Me Too movement, the Women's March, understanding indigenous causes. The shift in discourse is happening in seemingly mundane, non-institutional ways of organizing politics. So maybe we need a little bit of shift with the way we think about how young people enact politics. Maybe it's not the big P politics. Maybe it's the small p politics. And when we reflect on that, why is that? Why is there an allure for more casual, less permanent, more fleeting forms of politics? I think the answer to that is because when we think about old political institutions, it's radically exclusionary. I don't see myself taking part in those institutions. No one looks like me in those institutions, right? But when I look at new and emerging forms of digital institutions, and I see people like me, literally like me, who can speak up, who can push back, who can set the agenda, then that is inspiring. But the danger there, I'm not overselling my generation, millennials have their problems too, but the problem there is it's fleeting. And I think that's what we need to figure out in our generation. Our political participation is fleeting. We come together in a single issue, fight together, and then disperse. I think that's the way I see collective action these days. It's not permanent, it's fleeting. Whether that's a good or a bad thing, I think remains to be seen, but certainly there's something empowering about that.
Ian.
Thanks, Christoph, and sorry for making you walk all the way up the stairs. Nicole, that was great. I really enjoyed that, and thank you so much for sort of pushing back on what is an extremely patronizing narrative, particularly about the Philippines, that's been very, very popular in many, many circles. I'm curious, though, about in the process of deliberation, with all of the actors that you were working with, all the community that you were working with, did they want particular technological solutions? And were they substantively different, and how were they substantively different from those kind of Facebook magic bullet solutions that come from Mark Zuckerberg while he's surfing or whatever else.
Yeah.
Do we have more questions? Maybe also from the other side. Yes. Kelsey, do you want to? There's a microphone on the other side as well.
Hi, Nicole. It's so lovely to hear from you. Amazing presentation. Thank you for that. My question is, I'm wondering if you heard different stories in Mindanao, I suppose from the rest of the Philippines. It's coming from how diverse is the perspectives towards Marcosists across regions in the Philippines. Perhaps Mindanao's idea of the Marcosists may be less about the myth of the gold, but more of the association of the massacres, the Jabina massacres that were ordered by Marcos Sr., and so I'm wondering if you've listened to stories where supporting Marcosists is less about their idea that there's going to be 1 million, but more about practical things. It's going to be a continuing support towards the peace process in Mindanao. That is why they've supported the Marcos tandem. Maybe it's more because Marcos and Duterte supports the peace process that's happening at the moment. So I wonder if you've heard stories like that. Thank you.
Was a very interesting question. Do we have one more question?
I'm being grilled by the Filipino PhD community.
Congratulations, Nicole. That was an extremely fascinating presentation, and your research is amazing. I did want to ask whether you've looked at, and you did mention the political dynasties, and I do wonder, what is the role of the broadcast media and all this when the complication of, in the Philippines, you have elites owning these mass media companies. And I know during the Duterte regime, he actively cracked down on one of the biggest media companies, ABS-CBN, due to how they broadcasted his campaign. But I'm interested in all that as well. And maybe they are also a key player in terms of making this deliberately forum reality. Yeah, thank you.
Such good questions. Looking forward to your answers.
Yes. Let's start with the first question about did people want technological solutions? Not necessarily. There was a deliberation actually about whether the Philippines needed an anti-fake news law. And one of the experts, actually, my colleague Ross Tapsell from the ANU was one of the experts we invited, and he talked about the anti-fake news legislation in Singapore, and if I'm not mistaken, Malaysia, and how these anti-fake news legislations are weaponized to curtail the opposition. So when the participants in our forum heard that, they said, okay, yeah, we probably need an anti-fake news legislation, but there needs to be strong safeguards so the government in power will not use them to curtail the opposition. And then they deliberated further, and they asked, all right, but how can we track people who are peddling fake news? The National Bureau of Investigation should be empowered to be able to conduct investigations. And then someone from the group actually said, but that's the problem, isn't it? We have all of these laws, but the main agency in charge of investigating cybercrime is not funded. So what I notice is there is a lot of going back to precisely the institutions that should be working and should be funding implementing agencies to uphold all of these legislation. But yeah, there was very little attention on technological solutions. We did invite a representative from Meta to actually explain what Meta is doing, but that didn't really resonate so much, maybe because it's quite technical on the policy level. The question about Mindanao narratives of Marcos Sr., from my very limited fieldwork in Mindanao, unfortunately, before the pandemic, so a lot of these conversations are having digitally, the support is not really with Marcos Jr., but with Sara Duterte, right? So the Duterte brand is still very strong in Mindanao, precisely because Sara Duterte is a daughter of Mindanao. And for those who aren't familiar with politics in the Philippines, what are the voting lines? How do people vote? Is it ethnicity? Is it religion? Is it parties? Is it families? On the national level, It's usually per region and linguistic groups, right? So that's why people from Mindanao who speak Bisaya, the same language that Sara Duterte speaks, and she's from Mindanao, and her father as well, is actually, that's where they get their strongest constituency. So, but actually, since we're on this topic, Mindanao is actually a very interesting hub for disinformation initiatives. I've joined several Facebook groups in Mindanao promoting a particular, I mean, we have to anonymize this, promoting a particular cause, right? A very benign cause. And then suddenly in 2000, close to 2022, that Facebook page suddenly changed its name to Sara Duterte for President. So suddenly that page has like 300,000 members who joined because of that particular mundane cause, and then suddenly we're all supporting Sara Duterte. So there's a lot of these innovations that I first saw among not necessarily entrepreneurial actors in Mindanao. This is actually why I really resent the point that the Philippines is a petri dish, like a testing ground for disinformation. Hello, we are creative. We import disinformation tactics. And this is why this is also, a lot of our colleagues from DFAT are also looking at the Philippines to see if any of these tactics are imported in Australia. The question about, yes, broadcast media. So when strongman Rodrigo Duterte was in power, he did he and his allies did exert effort in curtailing media freedom in the Philippines. So ABS-CBN, one of the largest private television network in the Philippines, was shut down based on bogus allegations. And this really fragmented the media landscape in the Philippines. So just imagine ABC, even though it's government-owned. Imagine a privately owned ABC being shut down. So people from the regions are basically on an information and news desert because they lost the primary media network. But actually, that's a really good point. If you look at the media conglomerates in the Philippines, these are all family-run, and they're actually kingmakers of politicians. Ana Pertiera, who works at the University of Western Sydney, actually makes an argument that the logic of political patronage in Philippine politics is actually mimicked with the logic of political patronage in media networks. You can just sense how king-making is done in these media networks. So in a way, of course, there's room for critique with established media networks in the Philippines. They do have a role to play in perpetuating political dynasties. They do have a role to play in creating populists, right? In the Philippines, the only politicians on the national level who can actually beat political families are athletes, like boxers, basketball players, actors, and newscasters. And how are they able to beat political dynasties? Because of the media, right? Because of their star power. So yeah, the media does a lot of, the established institutions of mass media do have a role to play in perpetuating the patronage politics in the Philippines. But at the moment, the argument that my colleagues and I are putting forward is we are seeing a fragmented media sphere in the Philippines. In the last election, for example, one news channel run by, and I'm not kidding, a man who claims that he is the appointed son of God, who is under arrest with the FBI for, I think, I will not, because this is recorded, I might get sued for libel, but who is under arrest by the FBI. He has his own news channel, and a lot of Marcos supporters watch that channel. So it's like the Fox Newsification of the Philippines. That's not been the case before. So yeah, it's now become a fragmented media sphere, people listening to news that affirms and hardens existing political identities. So yeah, I will just maybe affirm that comment.
What a fascinating discussion. Are there any last-minute pressing questions before we close off the night? last chance to ask your questions to Nicole. Yes, I knew there would be one more. Do you want to have the microphone?
Thank you very much, Nicole. I'm going around door knocking and leafleting and et cetera, for the Yes campaign at the moment in Australia. So I'm really interested in your idea of these fleeting politics of the... There's quite a number of young people that we're talking with who say, oh, referendum? And so I get that momentary, there's a kind of connection between a number of different things at that moment. Yeah. But when one's talking with that political moment, you have to then kind of engage with a whole heap of deep institutional stuff that is not, it's the fleetingness doesn't facilitate. So ethically, you have to think about not falling into the same trap of finding the emotional trigger, right? In exactly the same way as the foxification, blah, 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 or however else is used. So I'd be really interested in your reflections about the ethics of the engagements with fleeting politics.
Yes, that's a very hard question. But first of all, you have my full support and solidarity with the Yes campaign. I have no voting rights in Australia. I'm not Australian, but I have discursive rights, and you have my full support and solidarity. So I like that you framed your question in terms of ethics, because a lot of political scientists actually would describe what is. What is happening at the moment is that, especially with young people, the way young people see politics today is politics on demand, right? Like Netflix, right? You curate your own playlist. In the same way you curate your own playlist on Netflix, on Spotify, you curate your own playlists of issues that matter to you. And sometimes they're contradictory, sometimes they're not. And that is the problem that political parties face today. You create a party manifesto, right? But the content of the party manifesto does not fully resonate to a person because we think of politics as Spotify, right? I like this, I like that, but I kind of don't like that. That manifesto does not speak to me. And this is why in many countries, they're starting to experiment in more referendums, not just Switzerland, but more single issue type politics to give voice to the primary issue of the day, right? And that is precisely fleeting. We coalesce in particular campaigns. Is that ethical? I think it can be made ethical. It can be made ethical if we are accountable to each other. If we say that on this particular issue, we coalesce and we agree that this is an inclusive campaign. We agree that this is a campaign that is based on evidence and reason, right? We can be governed by certain values, but there is no pressure for us to agree on subsequent types of issues. And this is where I think the agonistic Democrats inspire me, because in those coalitions we fight, but we fight today in order for us to be friends again tomorrow, so we can fight some more, right? Because I think if we just strive to have agreement in all campaigns, we lose voices along the way. So the priority for me is whatever the content of the campaign is, how do we make space? How do we make space, right? How do we bring a big tent together? And then how do we dismantle that tent ethically, with solidarity, with respect? Because the way we dismantle that tent after a particular campaign sets the tone to how we build a new tent in the next campaign. So maybe I'm too proceduralist. Maybe I'm like, I don't really care about the substance too much as the process in how we do politics. But I think that's the kind of politics that's needed today when ideologies are more fluid, when beliefs are more fluid, when people change their minds all the time. I think we need to invest in our processes of coalition building more than just hardening what we collectively believe in.
I think we have to close, unfortunately. now more questions are coming, and I'm sure that everybody has some more thoughts. I do too. But first of all, I want to thank you, and I want to thank the audience. But I will also, yes. Absolutely fascinating research, absolutely fascinating work, very important, not only for the Philippines, I think much more for a broader region and for the world. But I will also give the floor to the generous host.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much. My name's Tarun Nagesh. I'm the curatorial manager of the Asian and Pacific Art team here at the Queensland Art Gallery and Gallery of Modern Art. On behalf of the gallery, it's my great pleasure to offer a very, very brief vote of thanks. Firstly, of course, to our speaker, Professor Nicole Curato from the University of Canberra. Thank you for travelling here to speak tonight, as well as all the time and thought you put into your presentation. It was one I was really looking forward to. 2 quadrillion thank yous to you. Thank you for weaving in such incredible insights into recent political and social history in the Philippines, but really drawing on, I think, very universal pressing ideas of the circulation, instrumentalisation of information. I was particularly interested in, how you articulate the danger of these dominant narratives, how they're applied in Western thought models as compared to the global South. Really, I thought was fascinating the connections, of injustice to the perpetuation of disinformation. And of course, the impacts on democracy and actual values of truth, which I think Christoph touched on as well. What I found particularly inspiring was that you're not just bringing to light some rather pessimistic states of the world and the Philippines, but actually pathways forward, and bridging the academic to the kind of community co-development with subversively hopeful outcomes. Thank you very much for responding so thoughtfully to all the questions as well. It's something we really value in Perspectives Asia, this, really vibrant discussion, but your answers sounded like they were scripted perfectly over hours, quite honestly. So thank you, Nicole. I'd also like to give a very warm welcome and thanks to Christoph as his first address from the Griffith Asia Institute, and we're completely thrilled to be working with Christoph on the Perspectives Asia series in the future, welcoming your expertise and design of the future program, continuing a partnership which is coming up to about 18 years, I think, between the Queensland Art Gallery and Gallery of Modern Art and Griffith Asia Institute. Christoph recently moved to Brisbane, but he actually attended Perspectives Asia before he even started the role at Griffith Asia Institute, so I can feel your loyalty. I'd also really like to thank Professor Ian Hall for leading so much of the lecture series over the last year or so, bringing so many wonderful speakers to Quagoma. I know that we were talking about bringing Nicole like a year ago or something. I was really looking forward to it, so I'm really thrilled that it's finally happened. And I look forward to continuing to lean on all of your expertise and advice for various other activities. Special thanks to Megan and Kelsey for making tonight possible, and our volunteers for welcoming everyone. Please do look out and make sure you subscribe to Griffith Asia Institute for the upcoming Perspectives Asia series. The next lecture is on the 9th of November, which focuses on Australia's pivot to India, so I think that'll be a great discussion as well. Finally, thanks to you all, critical thinkers and conspiracy theorists alike. We can't tell the difference, apparently. And we look very forward to seeing you all soon. Thank you.